Kenneth, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
All right, here we are. Kenneth, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and set this up here. I didn't want to interrupt before. All right. Thank you for allowing me to tune in. My name is Kenneth Gajda. I am the master rigger and loft manager for United Parachute Technologies. We manufacture the Vector Sport container and the Sigma tandem systems. I've been asked to have a small chat about MARDS in general, what they are, and go a little bit further into the details on some thoughts behind them. If you're not familiar with what a MARD is, we're going to cover that in just a second. I do know that it's getting late in Europe as well, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. I know there's some jump tickets coming up soon, so hopefully that'll keep you guys awake through this. I've mixed it up a little bit with various details, some videos as well to keep it interesting. And I please, if anybody has any questions or any concerns about what we're covering, please note it down so that we can have it in the Q&A session towards the end. Let's see right here. All right, so MARDS, what is an actual MARD? What does it stand for? And MARD stands for Main Assisted Reserve Deployment. If we talk about a traditional RSL, we have a connection from the main. So in the event of breaking away, it will pull the pin out on the reserve container. That means that we actually, with an RSL, we have a main activated reserve deployment. But we want to go a little bit further than that. So let's look at the principle of a MARD system itself. We're taking a current RSL system and we're trying to advance it. We have a little bit of a gray area from when the pin gets extracted on the reserve container. After that, the jumper has to, we're talking from a breakaway here, so we have a parachute down. When the breakaway happens, the jumper will start dropping, start accelerating again until they have reached enough speed and drag for the reserve pilot chute to extract the reserve. So what we want to do is we want to try and capture that part in there and minimize it as much as we can. So we're already using a deployed main canopy, whether it's fully deployed or partially deployed. Either way still works because the additional materials that we have out in the air can help us create drag. Drag is what's going to help us. It's the principle of a small pilot chute, whether it be a main pilot chute or a reserve pilot chute, and we're just increasing the size quite a bit. The upside to this is we want to try and reduce the altitude loss that we have during an emergency procedure situation. We have a main parachute out. We want to try and avoid having or pushing the limits of what the certification allows us. The certification for our container system, ours specifically the TSO, means that we need to have a reserve deployed 3 seconds or 300 feet after the activation. So that means after the pin comes out from the closing boom. With a MARD, we're going to try and use the main parachute that's already out to try and limit that and decrease both the time and the altitude used before we have that reserve deploying. Obviously, that's going to help us out because altitude is our friend in any given situation. We want to have as much altitude below us, especially when there's an emergency situation, as possible. Here's an example of a MARD system coming out. It's extracting via the main through the reserve bridle. You can see the reserve pilot chute is not doing much and extracting out the reserve. So that's what we're talking about tonight. That is a MARD system in the most basic configuration there is. What are the benefits of the MARD system? Well, as we just covered, we want to try and limit the amount of time and altitude that's used right after we initiate emergency procedures. That means that we're going to take a lot of drag that's already out, already inflated, already loaded up because we're hanging suspended by our suspension lines from the main canopy. Whether it's a fully inflated, nicely flying with a hole in it, or whether it's a malfunctioning, possibly spinning main parachute. What happens if we try and use this we can lower the risk of line twist because we're not going to drop as far away from the parachute that we just got rid of until the reserve comes out. Again, we're shorting the time, we're shorting the altitude, and thereby shorting the risk of, for instance, line twist or any other things that can go wrong with the reserve deployment. We're going to use less altitude, covered that a second ago, because that's obviously better for us. even if we get a slight bit of line twist on our reserve, because everything goes fast, there's always going to be a risk. We have more altitude now to deal with that. Part of the certification for reserve parachutes is to induce line twists on it as part of the certification, to make sure that these parachutes can still open, inflate, and fly, even with a line twist that the jumper can then handle afterwards. And of course, we have the added backup for a jumper in there, because we are very heavily relying on jumpers doing the proper procedures, pulling all of their handles in the right order. But a lot of times with the MARD system, since we're shortening up the time, they beat the jumper to actually pulling their reserve handle and pin. So we're even having a system now that is going to be ahead of the jumper, ensuring that there's a reserve activation happening, and trying to and get this reserve out of the free bag as soon as possible. With the TSO certification that we use within the FAA in the US, like I mentioned before, we have about 3 seconds of 300 feet to get that reserve out. And that's in any given situation. That can be from a terminal ride, or that can be from after a breakaway. With the MARDS system, it has been shown that we're reducing this down to less than a second and less than 100 feet. Now that's a lot of give on a situation like this. It can be a massive difference. Obviously, we always expect people to do their procedures, follow their altitudes. But if things get out of hand, we get a little bit of tunnel vision, we get a little bit low, that's going to make a big difference on the altitude. The types of MARDs that are out there, there are quite a variety now. UPT introduced the very first MARD as part of the Sigma system back in 2003. The Sigma had been out on the market about 2 years before it got introduced, or before the Skyhook got introduced as a mandatory part of the system. Before that, there was a lot of development, and we'll get back to that in a second. Now, there are other manufacturers out there that currently use the Skyhook itself. They're licensed by UPT to use the Skyhook. There are other manufacturers as well that have created their own designs, came out on the market. They have various names, and they're all great systems that have been thoroughly tested. When we talk a little bit about MARDs on our end, we talk about passive and active MARDs. So a passive MARD would be something that is in your container, not actively put together from the main through the RSL to the bridle. So it can be something that attaches later, or at any given time during the breakaway and emergency procedure process. Active MARDs are the ones that are already attached, where it will almost be the opposite. That would have to be a reaction to get it released again. Now, the Skyhook is an active MARD. The Skyhook is put in and put together with the lanyard during the reserve packing. There are others that are not, where the bridle and the MARD system are completely independent. So the Skyhook itself, we have a picture of it here. That's obviously, that's kind of how the name came about. It's a small hook that's been sewn onto the reserve bridle. It connects via a lanyard. So we have a black lanyard that comes from the main parachute. We have a white lanyard down to the pin, and we have a red lanyard that goes to the Skyhook. Now that red lanyard is an interesting point that we'll get back to a little bit later in it, but that is the connecting point that creates the MARD connection for the Skyhook. It was invented by Bill Booth. I said earlier that we introduced it in about 2003 or so, but it was something that Bill worked on for many years before that, probably about 15, 20 years before it even came to fruition. There were a lot of obstacles to get over. There was a lot of challenges, a lot of things that had to be solved before he could really start putting this into a testing phase in the end of the 90s. The biggest obstacle was solved by something that we call the Collins lanyard principle, or the Collins lanyard concept, which in short is ensuring that if you ever have one riser leave before the other, it can be from a failure, it can be from misrigging, that you never ever have half a canopy attached to your container and your harness system with the MARD starting to activate. The Skyhook itself was originally developed for the tandem systems because during the deployment, during the emergency procedures for the tandem systems, we would see instructors using more time than on sport container systems. Actually allow a little bit more because it's a heavier, bigger system. So we have a little bit up, I think it's up to like about 5 seconds before it needs to be, we have to have a reserve out. Well, that means that from the second you break away, from the second that pin comes out, there's a time frame where a tandem couple are going to start accelerating. There's another passenger on, it can be hard to handle, and there was a risk of them tumbling through the deploying reserve. That means tumbling through lines, tumbling through bridle, etc. And that was really the original reason for trying to develop the Skyhook. It was purely minded towards the Sigma, the tandem systems, the Vector 2 tandem systems at the time, that then turned into the Sigma system. However, as with a lot of other things, when the test jumpers were testing this, they found that it was so efficient to have a MARD system on that they wanted it on their own sport gear as well. And essentially, that's how it came about. It came from the request from test jumpers saying, we want this in our personal gear. This is really, really good. I want this in case anything happens where I need that extra altitude. And that's how it moved over to the sport gear. And the development phases turn into both sides. So the functionality of it, I'm going to show a quick little video here that shows the difference between an RSL activation of the reserve and the deployment that happens afterwards versus the Skyhook deployment of the reserve. And I say deployment because it's a main assisted deployment of that. So we're going to show that video side by side. We'll have the RSL on the left-hand side, and we'll have the Skyhook deployment on the right-hand side. As you can see, we have the Skyhook deployed reserve already open. The RSL side is coming afterwards, spending more time, spending more altitude, and opening up lower. The reserve is out of the bag at the same time as that reserve pilot chute starts catching air. So you can see there's a massive difference in the altitude and time spent there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how does it work in case I have a total malfunction. So if I don't have the main out, how does this work? Because creating a MARD is fairly simple. We can just sew it onto the bridle. But as skydivers, of course, we can have a total malfunction. A MARD system won't do you any good unless you have some part of the main out to create the drag. So we need to be able to release it. So the easiest way to look at this is we're going to focus just on the Skyhook itself in the videos that are coming now. We're only going to focus on the Skyhook and the lanyard, and to see the difference between a pull from the RSL and a pull from the pilot chute itself. You're going to see that the lanyard is going to load up and carry the Skyhook and thereby continue to carry the free bag with a canopy in it on a Skyhook deployment. And you're going to see that it is going to release and slide off if the pilot chute has a pull, meaning, for instance, in a total malfunction. Here's a pull from the Skyhook. We'll see it loads up. And now it is going to continue moving and extracting the reserve bag that will be on the left-hand side. Now, naturally, this is just for illustration purposes. On actual gear, we'll have various directional pulls, etc. But this is just for illustration. Now we'll see it again with the reserve pilot chute pulling, leaving the lanyard on the container system. And now we're going to have a standard reserve deployment at that point. Then we talked a little bit earlier about the Collins lanyard concept, about what if one riser releases? Well, if it's your non-RSL riser, you're going to hang by half a canopy and wonder what's going on, probably do emergency procedures at that point. If it happens on the RSL side, we might have a problem. Before a jumper starts realizing what's going on, the MARD system, as we saw before, how efficient and fast it was, could at this point have deployed the reserve parachute. So now you'd have a reserve parachute deployed right next to a half a main attached still to you. So to solve this issue, to solve this problem, the Collins lanyard was developed. It is a small connection on the RSL lanyard itself, where the breakaway cable to the opposite riser routes through. So that means if the RSL side, whatever reason, break, any type of failure, misrigging or so, maybe half a pull on incorrectly adjusted breakaway cables, if that releases, the non-RSL side will also release. So it'll be illustrated here in this video. There's the release on the RSL side. There's the yellow cable being loaded up by the Collins lanyard, which then releases the non-RSL side just prior to pulling the pin and opening up the container. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the considerations, because obviously any idea is great. If we have a sort of a new development that we want to pursue, you have to take into account all the considerations about what about this situation? What about this situation? What about this situation? So what we have is, we don't want the Skyhook to interfere with any normal reserve deployment during a total malfunction. Well, that's what we just illustrated. We had the release of the Skyhook lanyard in case the pilot chute starts pulling on a total malfunction. It'll simply just sit back in the container. The lanyard will still be in the container, and so will the main risers, because we have a total. Then it also needs to be able to release at any point after the initial extraction. Reason being is that we don't know what happens after you break away. What if there's a misrouting or something? What if you're tumbling at the time through your lines? Now, we could be that we have a partial canopy out, maybe even a backlog that doesn't create a lot of drag. A lot of things can happen up there. So we want to make sure that if there's at any point more force coming from the pilot chute itself, the reserve pilot chute, that takes over and continues extracting the reserve canopy. We don't want the Skyhook, even after initial extraction, even after the initial load, to ever be a hindrance in that. That's what we saw as well when the lanyard slid off. That can happen at any point. Whichever side has the most power is going to continue deploying the reserve. Then we need to account for the RSL riser failures and releases, and that's what we just saw with the Collins lanyard, that the Collins lanyard is solving that. Now, that's what Bill was really fiddling with for a long time. And we had an engineer named Collins that basically came up with this, and he was fortunate enough to get it named after him. Then we also need to make sure that we have a weak link built into the system. Again, if we have a horseshoe malfunction, or if the slight chance happens that we have, say, a backlog, so we have no canopy out, nothing to really slow us down, we're going full terminal speed, we do our emergency procedures, and right as we have broken away, that canopy comes out of the bag. Well, now that main is going to transfer the opening shock through the MARD system onto the connection and essentially whipping out the reserve bag. Now, we don't want to risk that, because even with the current designs, if the safety stow fails, or if the safety stow slides off because there's so much force on there, then we could essentially leave the canopy bag in the container. We don't want to risk that. So there's a weak link built into the system, and that is the red Skyhook lanyard. It's made out of a specific material that fails around 250, 300 pounds. So it's not a lot when you think about opening shocks. That's actually a fairly low one. So that's why we've seen red Skyhook lanyards that would break, and that is per design. If they get overloaded, they can break. And the last thing we have is we don't want the reserve pilot chute to interfere during the reserve, the Skyhook extraction of the reserve and the deployment of that reserve. Meaning that as soon as the Skyhook loads up and pulls away, as we saw in the first video, we don't want the pilot chute now trailing down, looping around and catching onto the reserve. And the only simple way of solving that is just positioning on the bridle. The distance from the Skyhook for us onto the pilot chute is less than the distance from the Skyhook onto the bag. That means that pilot chute can't loop down and around and catch the bag. So that's solved with the placement on the bridle. Then we got to go a little bit into some of the rumors and facts, because obviously, especially in today's world with the internet, there's a lot of opinions out there, there's a lot of thoughts, and there's a lot of assumptions going on. So we always encourage people to contact us. We'll always provide an answer. We'll always try the hardest to give an answer on any questions that might be out there. Some might be directly related to proprietary information, so we can't obviously disclose that, but we'll start trying to explain something. So you're always welcome to contact us. But some of the most common ones is, if I have a MARD, I can pull lower, because if I ever have a malfunction, it is going to save the day. Now, just having a MARD does not substitute for any type of proper altitude awareness or procedures to be used, okay? You want it the day when everything else goes wrong and you need that little bit extra altitude. You don't want to push, you don't want to start sucking that up every time you jump. Another thing is that we hear sometimes is, I don't need to have my RSL attached anymore because I have a MARD in the system. I don't want to have my shackle on just in case it gets windy. Well, since the MARD is a continuation of the RSL, if you disconnect your shackle on any part of your container system, removing the connection from your main to your RSL, you have also, in effect, disconnected the Skyhook itself, okay? Or any type of MARD. So that's also important to keep in mind. Then we have the seal thread is to make sure it doesn't ever disconnect. Now, for the riggers out there, when this is being packed and the lanyard is put onto the Skyhook, they tie a single round of seal thread around onto the Skyhook. That's simply just to keep this, the lanyard in place during the packing when it moves around there and during that initial load. Like I said in the video, we saw it one direction. If it starts going in another direction, it's just to keep it in place until it loads up on the Skyhook. Now, the upside to that is that most of the times when we have a Skyhook deployment, the reserve pilot chute and the freeback tends to stay attached to the lanyard and goes down with the main. So if you find the main, you tend to find the reserve freeback and the reserve pilot chute, or the other way around. The Collins lanyard is yellow. Now that's kind of a little bit of something that has happened in the recent years, because in 2009, we introduced the yellow split lanyard. Now that was an optional installation. It wasn't mandatory. You can have a Skyhook without having the yellow Collins lanyard on there. But you see these three images, three examples of a lanyard here. On the left-hand side, we have a regular sport with a split RSL. In the middle, we have a regular sport RSL without any split. Could be on one of the earlier Skyhook installations. And then on the right-hand side, we have a tandem with a split. If we look at that, we can peel it back. The two yellow tapes effectively becomes the Collins lanyards. But on the middle one, because it doesn't have the split, that is still considered a Collins lanyard. So it's the concept of having the breakaway cable routed through that end of the RSL. That is the Collins lanyard. We highly recommend it on RSLs simply due to the nature of it, but we do find it to be, we do require it on Skyhook equipped containers. So it's mandatory on Skyhook equipped containers.
So it's actually an alternative factor.
Well, alternative facts. Yeah, you can call it that. And then my last favorite one, and this is an actual inquiry we had. How long does the battery last on your Skyhook? Well, as far as I know, we don't have any electronic MARDs out there. So all of them are non-electronic. They might need some maintenance over the years. It depends on the manufacturer. Currently, the Skyhook does not need any particular maintenance. Now, the little plastics that hold the lanyard in place, as riggers know, can crack over time from basically from use, packing, etc. And we can replace those easily. We can send those out to riggers, no problem. All right, that kind of covers everything that I wanted to cover tonight. And it was a quick little run through it. There's a lot of things to discuss when it comes down to MARDS. Hopefully I covered most of these. Looks like we still have a few minutes left for a Q&A session, but if anybody out there have any questions, whether it be about MARDS or any other type of equipment that we manufacture, please send me an email. It's straight up, kenneth@uptvector.com. If we don't get back to you in a timely manner, we have a lot of inquiries sometimes. Always feel free to shoot a follow up, and always feel free to give us a call in the rigging loft. Okay. All right. So that's all I have. So if there are any questions and such, I'm gonna shut this one down here a little bit so I can see.
We have a few. We have a few questions. Maybe just to give you some insights also in the participants today. About of the 100 participants, 70 more or less 70 answered our questions. And today, out of those 70, already 25 are using a MARD and 22 are using a standard RSL. So just to give you some numbers. The question was also, how important is an RSL or a MARD when you choose a new rig? And there, I would say that 22 people answered that it should definitely be equipped with a MARD, and there you go. And 48 answered that it should definitely be equipped with a MARD. So that's, I think, over half of the participants. So that's, I hope that's a comforting number for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so we've built the Skyhook, like I said, for almost 20 years. So it's coming out now 18 years. We would estimate that at least half of the containers all of the containers that we've ever manufactured through UPT are equipped with MARD systems now, or with the Skyhook, simply because it has become the standard now. We see rarely now, we see no RSL or MARD on there, but we do see some with just the RSL on that. We've had over the years, over the first 10 years, I would say, we had a lot of retrofit installations on older gear as well. Any Vector 3 container and any Sigma container out there can have a retrofit done. We can't do it on the Vector 2s, it's a different design. But yeah, we like to see, because obviously we believe very much in this concept. There are always discussions about whether you should use it for one type of jumping or another type of jumping. We know there are concerns about small canopies, but that's a personal choice. Me personally, I've jumped it on my competition peregrine canopies, Skyhook, and had a deployment. And others choose not to. And that's, again, it's a choice. We just have a product that we offer, and we see that other manufacturers have followed that path to create MARDs for their equipment. So anything that is new will always go through the stages of people testing it out, people starting to jump with it, and then there's a transition through the generation of jumpers. Obviously, some of the older jumpers out there have seen it with AEDs, they've seen it with RSLs, they've seen it with a lot of things, and now we're into the MARD system where most manufacturers actually offer it.
Yeah, so those are also a few questions that pop by, like, can I install it on this type of rig or that type of older rig? What is your advice on that?
Well, so currently we have it on Vectors, which we manufacture. Also, SunPath have it licensed to use on their containers. Aerodyne have it licensed to use in their containers, and Parachute Systems have it licensed to use in their containers. They've done the proper testing for it, but they've licensed the actual MARD system itself. So there are some container manufacturers out there that use the Skyhook itself, whereas others have chosen to go their own direction with their own MARD systems.
Okay. Another question from somebody is, what altitude would you recommend to have a hard tag to use on the Skyhook? Problems on
as high as possible. Always. So here's the thing: you should always treat a MARD as a bonus. The MARD systems in general are created to release because we are skydivers and we can have total malfunctions. Some MARDs are set up so that they can release at any point when there's an overpowering from the reserve pilot chute. Others are more favored towards the main canopies. However, you should never change your procedures, your regular procedures, as if you were the one pulling all of your handles instead of changing that over to something for a MARD. So always use the procedures that you are taught if you pull the handles, and always pull your handles. I mean, that's the end of it. Even if you get beat, then it's just a good day.
Okay, one last question then maybe, which is kind of an interesting one of Dan. It says, is there a specific reason why UPT decided to go with a MARD system?
That's really what came down to Bill's final product, because Bill went through a lot of different types of MARD designs, levers, little strings, all sorts of different ones. And when I went over the considerations, we needed to try and create a MARD system that would adhere to every part of those considerations. And there are some additional considerations put into the mix as well. But all these had to be part of it. So basically going through the process of elimination, some of these designs, some of these concepts were thrown out, and then it started going in there. And essentially it became down to Bill just coming in one day and going, this is what I want, this is what I got, this is what we're going to pursue, this is what I think is the right thing. And the upside to the Skyhook is that if we go in the direction of changing designs and container systems, or changing deployment process, et cetera, in the future, it has the ability, because it's a lever system, essentially. You place the lanyard in a leverage position so you can tweak it over time to fit into, let's say, other designs of containers or other uses. So there's some workability around it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kenneth, for staying with us late in the evening on our side, and everybody to participate. I would say if you have any questions, Kenneth listed up his email address, so he'll definitely be free to answer any MARD-related questions from that perspective. He still has a long day in front of him, I would assume, so he still has some time.
Yeah, it's in the middle of the afternoon here, so
there you go.
Thank you so much, guys.
If you can't sleep and think all night about the MARD system, he's your man. So for the rest, thank you, Kenneth, and it leaves it up to Gerrit to do his usual thing at the end of the day.